I want to start things off by giving you an overall picture on what's happening with destruction or RBD simulations. Whenever we do any kind of work, we're either fracturing something, we're adding constraints, or we're actually simulating on the object. And it's really helpful to think about it like this because rigid body dynamics, the hardest thing about it is knowing where you're going and keeping track of all the information so that it doesn't become too cluttered and disorganized. That's a big part about it. So I want to give you an idea of what the process looks like up front so that you know why we're doing certain things and where we're going. Starting with the fracture, fracturing breaks up the model into smaller pieces. These fragments come apart when something affects them, and that's basically how any destruction simulation works. Now, one thing to know is that fracturing typically occurs before the simulation takes place. And so we chunk up all of these different models ahead of time, and then they're just sitting there waiting for something to happen to them. Once they get affected by something, that's when you see all of these different pieces flying around. However, just so you know, just for your own knowledge, there is also something called dynamic fracturing. And so that's when something hits an object and it figures out its fracture on the fly, on the spot. And that can happen within the solver. But it's most common to pre-fracture things because you have a better control over the actual fracturing of the object. And so you actually get more control over the shapes. And it's just the most common workflow that people go through when they're trying to fracture stuff. Okay, so there's typically two main ways of pre-fracturing an object. We have Voronoi fracturing. This is where points are scattered along an object, pieces are broken up into these cells, and these cells are determined by how close they are to the surrounding points. So just as a brief demonstration, if let's say we have this chunk, there's a point right in the middle, and what this basically means is that if anywhere on this chunk is closest to this point, then that's what makes it part of this chunk. And as soon as, let's say we're going across a sphere, this chunk right here, an area along the sphere right here, is now closest to this point. Now it belongs to this chunk. So it basically just breaks things up by looking at the surface area and determining how close it is to the nearest point. We'll talk about that in a bit more detail as we go along, but for now, that's a good way of thinking about Voronoi fractures. We also have Boolean fractures though, and this is where you take a piece of geometry, in this case a cutting plane, and you slice right through an object. So it's pretty visual right here in what's happening, but I kind of picture a knife going through the model, and you're just kind of cutting it up in a more custom shape by Booleaning the model itself. We'll talk about the pros and cons between Voronoi and Boolean, when you want to use Boolean, when you want to use Voronoi. The most common one that people use all the time is Voronoi, but I'm actually not a big fan of that look just because most things don't break off in a Voronoi pattern. So again, we'll talk about that here as we go along, but just so you know, these are the two main ways of fracturing to think about. So we have these pieces, but we need to also hold them together. So that's why we have constraints. And constraints hold the pieces together. So if you haven't watched Houdini for the New Artist 2, or you're not sure about what a primitive means, then go ahead and review the basics here because with destruction, it's not a beginner topic. And so if you are a beginner in Houdini, go check out the intro courses that I have. I'm going to assume that you know what a primitive is, that you know what the geo spreadsheet is, that you know what attributes are, all of that good stuff, okay? But for constraints, it's a polyline primitive. And so think of it as the math equation that gets drawn out, that draws out this line, is the primitive. Attributes get stored on that line, and depending on the attributes stored on this line, that determines the behavior of these constraints. We also have the points at the end, and these points identify the pieces by their name attribute. And that name attribute lives, again, on the point. So we basically have some kind of attribute on the point which identifies each piece, and then when it comes to the behavior of the constraints, that information lives on the attributes found on the primitive, which is, visually speaking, the polyline that gets drawn in between each of these points. There's all kinds of different constraints. We have glue, soft, hard, pin, slider, cone twist, spring, hinge, angular, and angular spring. And there's other constraints that you could use, but for rigid body dynamics, these are the ones at your disposal. So I know that seems like a lot, but in all practice, most of the time, I'm just dealing with glue, soft, or hard constraints. And we'll talk about examples and when you want to use these other ones. But for right now, let's just concern ourselves with a few of these basics for Destruction 1, and we'll just leave it at that. And if you're new to RBDs with Houdini, there's probably going to be a bit of confusion at first because there's all kinds of different solvers that you can find that have to do with simulation and how this all works. So we have a bullet RBD solver, we have a rigid body solver, RBD, and static. And they all kind of sound like the same thing, but they're all different, and it's kind of confusing to know which one you should use. And so, to simplify your life, think of it like that. We don't want to use anything but the rigid body solver. And the reason why we have these other solvers in here is because they're old and because Side Effects wants to make sure that if somebody opens up an old scene of Houdini, that everything still works. But it kind of alludes to a general problem that you'll come across with Houdini, and that is there's a huge mess of nodes that you could use, and it's hard to know which ones might be appropriate for the situation or outdated or brand new. I'm sure it'll take no time at all for Side Effects to release some new features with RBD stuff, and it doesn't necessarily mean that this course is out of date, but it means that there's going to be new nodes, new things to do, and that's just kind of part of the game here. Rigid body dynamics, it's something that's constantly in development, and so it's a moving target. Now, again, that's not to say that what I'm teaching you is going to get antiquated immediately, but it is to say that you're going to see some of these leftovers as you go. Now, what's even more confusing is that as soon as you lay down this rigid body solver in DOPS, we have another thing here called the solver engine. And so we have a solver within the solver. And so here we have bullets, we have RBD. Those are your main two options. And the thing that you want to use the most whenever you can is bullet. Bullet was not developed by Side Effects. That's why it's separate from RBD. The RBD solver is developed by Side Effects, and the only time you want to use RBD is if bullet can't do the job for you. If bullet doesn't work, then RBD is the next thing to go to. It's a lot slower though, so you have to only use that when you need to. But that's what is happening right there. And then in addition, you'll run into some confusion when it comes to the different objects that you can create within DOPS. So we have the RBD fractured object, packed object, just an RBD object, static object, and RBD point object. Depending on the scenario, you'll want to use a fractured object versus an RBD object versus an RBD packed object. It just depends on what the thing is and how it relates to the rest of the scene. And so this is another area that confuses people at first. It is actually very confusing at first. So we'll talk about that, and the way I'll teach it is we'll start off with the RBD packed object. That's what's most commonly used in destruction or RBD sims. And then I'll just give you some general scenarios that could use, let's say, an RBD fractured object versus an RBD object. And we'll just kind of start with understanding one thing and go from there. In the next video, I will introduce you to my friend Eugene the Genie. He's like this cool little porcelain statue that we have to work with. And I'll take you through the process from A to Z on how to make a very basic RBD simulation.